So, welcome back to the Financial Bites podcast. I'm your host and social media CPA, Chris Passmore. So, recently I was reading the news about bankruptcy, and I was surprised to see that according to the American Bankruptcy Institute, in January, the number of bankruptcies are up 19%. And I just happened to check what are some famous companies that I've known that have gone bankrupt, and I was blown away. It's General Motors, it's Marvel Entertainment, and near and dear to my heart, the Chicago Cubs. So I'm so excited to introduce my guest and bankruptcy expert, Brent George. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here.
It's great to talk to you. So let's just start with, who is Brent George and what made you to start your own firm about 14 years ago? Maybe talk about the types of clients you've been working with lately and fill our audience in a little bit.
Great. Thank you very much. I've been a licensed attorney since 1995. So I've been an attorney for quite a while. And I worked at the beginning for a couple of different law firms. And in around 2008, I was working for a fairly big law firm in Ventura County. And I was heading up the real estate business department. And that was at around the time that the economy had hiccups and started having some problems, some serious problems in around 2008, 2009. And a lot of the individuals that I was working with and companies that I was working with, their needs started to change, unfortunately, in a lot of cases for protection, asset protection, but inevitably a lot of them needed bankruptcy protection. Individuals that owned businesses and then businesses themselves. And that is where I became kind of an expert at it because that's what my clients were needing. And so after that, I opened up my own firm, and I've been, running my own office since, for about 14 years. So it coincides with when all that was going down, and been able to just keep it going for good luck. Up to this point in time, it's been going well. Clients are always, unfortunately, in need for the service that I provide. So I guess that's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
Yeah. So what types of clients? So, you've got personal, you got businesses, there's a number of different versions of bankruptcy, or what we'll say is BK. So
Yeah.
what types of clients are you working with lately?
Mostly, for the most part, it's individual debtors that own businesses as sole proprietorships or own a business, under LLC protection, and sometimes owning a corporation as well. Most of the time, it's the individual that needs the protection, and it's because the business itself maybe isn't they can't make it work anymore, or they had to shut it down. And obviously with COVID, we're still kind of dealing with the effects of the pandemic, and I think we will be for a long time. A lot of people have had to shut their businesses down as a result of maybe difficulty getting supplies or products, or just the economy in general. And so you can shut a business down, and if the business is the only liable entity and the business itself has no assets, then it's usually not necessary to file a bankruptcy for the business. It's when the individual behind the business is personally guaranteed, and they have a personal guarantee. They have skin in the game, and oftentimes they do. Their name is on a lease, they're on lines of credit. Normally that's what's going to be happening, unless it's just a very big company. But most of the companies that I work with are relatively medium to small size. So the individuals, they need the protection, more than the business itself. And that's where I come in.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm sure anybody who's even thinking about this, you think about your home, your personal assets, and you're probably a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation. So I'm curious about your perspective on just the volume of bankruptcies, what's going to be happening this year in 2023. I did a little bit of research, and I was shocked. There's actually been a downward trend in total bankruptcies from 2019 to 2022. And I know before that it was picked up. You mentioned 2008 through 2010. So, I mean, what are you seeing? Are you seeing it increase? Have you seen it fluctuate? Have you seen it vary by industry, like you mentioned, because of COVID? So what have you seen? And frankly, what are your thoughts on this year? Do you think we're going to see it go up, go down, stays in the middle?
Great question. There's always been a fluctuation, and it just depends on on whatever situation or circumstances we're dealing with as a country, economically and regionally. Yes, there was. Interestingly enough, within the year or two of the pandemic, bankruptcies were down. People were not filing as many bankruptcies. They didn't need it at the time, and in part because a lot of people were benefited in a good way from PPP. So a lot of people were getting extended unemployment benefits. Credit card companies were working with people more. They were hesitant to be aggressive during this tumultuous time for everybody. That's since changed. I've seen a shift. The shift is the credit cards are being companies are very aggressive, so they've gone full born. They're suing people for even small, amounts of debts, and a lot for in a lot of instances, businesses, they utilize the PPP money or other sources, and that's exhausted, as well as unemployment benefits, and they just have no where else to turn. And they're seeing in their mind, they're seeing kind of the walls closing in and the debts are piling and the phone calls are coming. And, it's a scare, like you said, it's a really scary time for a lot of people. So I am seeing an increase steadily. It hasn't really burst open like a lot of people have been saying that it is going to happen within the last year. I'm saying it's just going to be an explosion. I personally haven't seen that, but there's definitely an increase. More and more people are calling, and it's all different types of people. And it's people that are laid off, people that, like I said, owned a business, shutting down a business a year ago. Now the creditors are kind of coming after them. I expect for this year to be even, definitely higher than last year. And the trend that you mentioned from the American Bankruptcy Institute, I expect it to continue.
Wow. You know what?
Yeah.
I didn't think about that, but I could see where all of that government support from 2020 to 2022, maybe, I hate to say artificially, but gave people an extra runway that they normally wouldn't have with that support programs out there. That makes a lot of sense now, that maybe that helped push down the numbers. And now that those programs are wrapping up, things are starting to see a pickup. And I have to ask, just because you bring it up, you mentioned how even credit card companies are going after smaller amounts. I'm just kind of curious, what are you seeing? Because in my mind, I'm thinking if a credit card company is like, if it's $1,000, it's not worth their time and effort to go after that. Are you seeing, could that come down to that level, or
Not
higher or
quite that
lower?
low. I see very often credit card companies and debt collectors, because there's debt collectors, companies that buy the debts from the Capital Ones of the world and the B of A's of the world, and then they pursue the creditors, the debtors on behalf. They're the creditors now, and they will file lawsuits for as little as $2,000, which is surprising. It is, but like you mentioned, the time and the effort involved doesn't seem like it would be worth it, but they're hoping if they file a lawsuit and they serve the person, they scare, the individual debtor, they scare that person, frighten that person, prompt a phone call, then they can work out some kind of a payment plan. It must be working because they're doing it, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. But most of the lawsuits are for higher numbers, and sometimes the individuals have multiple lawsuits by multiple creditors, and yeah, that's not unusual either.
Wow. So let's dive in. I know there's various forms of bankruptcy. I think I read there's 6 different chapters or versions, but I imagine that there's got to be the main 2 or 3. So can you
Yeah,
walk our audience through the most widely used forms of bankruptcy, maybe how they differ? Because there's got to be some pretty significant differences. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many options.
there are huge differences. So Chapter 7 bankruptcy is the most common type of bankruptcy, and that's the type of bankruptcy that I typically do. And I'll contrast that to Chapter 13 in a moment, which is the other type of bankruptcy that commonly individuals will do. But the benefit of a Chapter 7 is as follows: the individual or individuals get a discharge of the unsecured debt, meaning anything that's not tied to collateral, personal loans, credit cards, medical bills. Car loans are not really impacted as long as the individual debtor or debtors want to keep their car, they have to keep making the payment. The same with the home loans. But it's the other types of debt that are, accruing interest on a daily basis, and that's called unsecured debt. Those are the ones that's the type of debt that Chapter 7 will eliminate. The the flip side, the problem for some people is qualifying. The qualification process for Chapter 7 is largely financial, and it's based on a very short snapshot of time period of the last 6 months of the individual's or household income. And so pay stubs or income and expense statements are really important to get a baseline of the income. And so there's something called the means test, which has to be passed, and it's based on how many people are in the household. Is it with children and so forth? If is there a household of 4, what's the total income for the house, for that household, gross income, and is it above or below the median income in California for a household of that size? If it's above it, you can still pass this means test by looking deeper at the individual's expenses. So the second part, when someone contacts me, and we're talking about a Chapter 7, is I'll need all the evidence of income for, usually I ask for a little more than 6 months, and then I provide them a form that has a list of most of the categories of expenses that exist for people, and they can provide me with a list of their average monthly expenses. And we essentially, just to kind of shortcut it, we essentially have to prove to the court that based upon the last 6 months of the average household income minus their expenses that have nothing to do with these credit cards, that they don't have anything left over or have very little left over, what's called disposable monthly income. Because what is trying to be determined is whether the individual who is filing bankruptcy would have enough left over if they stopped paying their debts to pay their creditors something back in a payment plan. So that's a Chapter 13. Okay. So Chapter 13 is a repayment plan. You're not typically paying the full amount of the debt. It is usually much less than 50%, but it's a 5-year plan. It's a long-term commitment, 60 months of payments, regular payments. And at the end, if you comply and you meet your obligations, then you get the debtor gets a discharge of whatever wasn't paid through the plan. So if they pay 30% of their overall debt, if they have $100,000 in debt, they pay 30% of it, then they get a discharge at the end of 70%. The benefit for a Chapter 7, if you can qualify, is that you don't have to pay anything to creditors. So that is obviously very attractive. The second benefit is less expensive type of a bankruptcy overall, but there are limitations as to what you're allowed to keep and what you may not be able to keep. So in some cases, if somebody can qualify for a Chapter 7 financially, then we have to look at what their asset situation and make sure that, look, you can do this, but you have too many what they call non-exempt assets. And so they have statutes that provide exemption amounts for different types of property and different types of assets. And the good news to that end is that for about 2 years now, the exemption the amount that you can keep of equity in your home has gone up significantly. It used to be as low as 75,000 in some cases. Now it's up to 600,000. This has opened the door to Chapter 7 bankruptcy to so many people that would otherwise not have done it. Because let's say somebody has $300,000 of equity in their home, and you don't really know exactly how much equity somebody has until they try to sell. But let's say we've done a formula, we've checked the different online websites like Zillow, and we've determined that they have roughly $300,000 in equity. Prior to the change in the law, they would not want to file bankruptcy, because what the trustee would do is they would say, well, a couple at that time could exempt 100,000. That's it. So what happens to the other 200,000? Well, the trustee could sell your property and take the proceeds and pay it to your creditors. In fact, the trustee who administers the bankruptcy has a fiduciary duty to act on the best interest or in the best interest of the creditors. So that was sometimes a very tough choice for people to make. Now, because of the extension, the increase in what you're allowed to exempt up to 600,000, it's just opened the door to so many people that can do it a bankruptcy now, and if their house is their primary asset, and for a lot of people that's exactly the situation that they're in. For most people, they get to keep it and still do the Chapter 7. Now, I have one more thing. If somebody has like $1 million, let's say, or $900,000 of equity, but they're in a financial pinch, they wouldn't want to do a Chapter 7 because, again, they have all this exposed equity. And the only way really to tap into that exposed equity is to sell the house. And really nobody wants that. So Chapter 13, as I mentioned, it's not the most popular, but one benefit is you get to keep all your property. They don't take your property in a Chapter 13, but you have to pay more. We don't have time to get into too much of the detail, but in a Chapter 13, if you have a house with a bunch of equity that you can't exempt, it increases what you pay during the life of the plan. But it works out for some people. And one last benefit of a Chapter 13 is if a husband and wife or spouses or an individual is behind on their mortgage, say they fell behind during COVID and the lender won't work with them and they're looking to foreclose. Chapter 13 will allow the borrower, the debtor, to repay the lender over the life of the plan. In effect, as long as they keep making their regular mortgage payment and the regular obligations, they're allowed to take the forbearance amount, extrapolate that over 60 months, and the creditor has to, the bank will say, has to take that and allow them interest-free, essentially, minimal interest, to pay it back and then get current by the end of the 5 years, and they cannot foreclose on them as long as they're in a valid active bankruptcy. So that's the positive of 13. But 7 is still by far the most popular. And then there's Chapter 11, which is for individuals or companies that have an extensive amount of debt. And that is pretty rare. And I really don't do a lot of the Chapter 11s. 95% of my practice is Chapter 7.
Okay. So it sounds like Chapter 7 is really where your unsecured debts are generally wiped clean. Your Chapter 13 is your reorganization, or let's call it good faith payment plan, but maybe a little bit more certainty in the assets. So what types of assets would be taken under a Chapter 7? Is it vehicles? Is it, 401k? What types of things actually do go away with a Chapter 7?
Well, you get essentially, if you don't have a house, and because if you have a home and you have a lot of equity, you're limited for the most part to preserving your home, and you don't get a lot else. You get a small separate vehicle exemption. But the truth is, with vehicles, trustees don't, at least up until very recently, don't like to take cars, because when they take a car, then they responsible for insuring it, and they have to sell it. It's not as easy as just taking money in the bank or cash. But certain types of accounts are generally not considered part of the bankruptcy estate. So retirement accounts, you mentioned 401ks, up to a certain limit. It's a pretty high limit. It's $1 million or so. So for most people, their retirement is completely protected. But vehicle equity is exposed unless you can exempt it, which most people can, because they have, their assets are under the threshold limits. Money on deposit, bank, money on account, just cash that somebody has, collectibles, things like that have value, things that you have to disclose that you own these things. Those are the kinds of things the trustees really looking for, just being able to take the cash. But strategy is a big part. I know that we're going to get to this, but there's ways to legally, what they call, convert the non-exempt assets and use it for appropriate things and delay a bankruptcy. And I guide people with that. And that's why talking to somebody like myself as early as possible is key, because it avoids a lot of problems.
Well, that's a good segue into our next talking point. When should someone call you? Because I imagine anybody who's thinking about it has had financial difficulty for a while. It's not like on Monday they were fine, on Tuesday they were in bad shape. So when do you normally recommend they pick up their phone, they call an expert like you and say, I need help? When does that normally happen? Or do you notice any triggers? Did something happen? They got a letter that was threatening. When is that, inflection point?
Well, a lawsuit from a creditor is always a tremendous motivator for people. But by the time it gets to that point, the individual or the business already is well aware of the problem that exists. So that it's best to contact somebody like myself as soon as you anticipate that there is a potential shortfall, a problem paying, your certain bills or certain vendors or certain debts. It and sometimes people just need to do an evaluation because they're looking at their situation. They're not in financial trouble per se. They're not in default, but they have a significant amount of credit card debt with significant interest component that just revolves and gets bigger. And they're making a payment every month, and they're basically just paying the interest.
Mhm.
And the debt or portion of it, and the debt itself is not reducing, or sometimes it's accumulating. That's a bad position to be in for the long haul,
Mhm.
and you could sustain it possibly for the rest of your days, but you may not be able to. Um, so it'd be a good idea if you're in that situation, you call somebody like myself, and I would tell the individual what it is that I would need to evaluate. Then we would do an evaluation based on that moment in time. We can't forecast the future per se, but that moment in time. And if there's just no chance you're going to be able to do this, I will tell them, look, it's just not available to you. And we can talk about other possible options like debt settlement that we offer, or different types of bankruptcies. But the earlier the better in terms of contacting them, because strategy is a huge component. It can prevent people from making mistakes that they didn't, understandably, they didn't know was a mistake at the time. They were doing the right thing. And I, I have an example of someone I spoke to yesterday that was doing the right thing. It's a woman who really needs to file a Chapter 7. And during my conversation, I found out that she is on a bank account with her father. That's okay, that's fine. But then she told me, the reason that she's on the bank account with her father is that she's been making payments. She's been paying him back on a loan that she took out, a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
Well, that's good. It's a good thing and shows that she's trying to pay her, a creditor. Problem is that in bankruptcy, there's a theme or a theory of bankruptcy law that says you can't play favorites among creditors. You have to treat them all equally. So her father would be considered an insider, with
Mhm.
like a preferential creditor. So she has to disclose, we would have to disclose to the trustee in the paperwork, because there was a specific question that is asked: have you paid an insider back any money on a loan or a debt within the last 12 months?
Mhm.
And in her case, the answer would be yes. Now, it's not in her case, it's not a huge amount. Sometimes it's a large amount. When I say that, I'll tell you, it's like it was like less than $2,000. So by law, a trustee can, what they call, claw back that money and say, well, now that this individual's filed for bankruptcy and you've received this amount of money from, and you're an insider, from the debtor, that's ours now. Because the bankruptcy courts have tremendous powers to do certain things that people don't realize. Now, they may not pursue it because there's time and an expense involved with that. They don't just get it with a snap of a finger. They have to pursue it legally. But in her case, she doesn't want her father to know about the bankruptcy.
Mhm.
And I can't promise her that they're not that the trustee wouldn't send her a letter and say, look, this money's ours. Send us a check for $1,000. So she's going to have to wait. If she's going to do this, there's a period of time we have to wait and we have to strategize. And um, so it's 1 year uh, for preferential creditors, like a family member. It's only 90 days for everybody else. And so if you're paying back creditors, it has to be over a certain amount, like $750 within a 90-day period. And for most people, they don't do that. But the bottom line, there's issues about, believe it or not, there are issues that make it such that it's frowned upon to pay creditors back prior to bankruptcy.
Wow.
And it could affect the timing. And if you can't do a bankruptcy now and a creditor has a judgment or getting a judgment, and they can garnish wages or they can take money out of the bank, there's nothing you can do, other than pay them back, or work out some kind of an agreement with them, because the bankruptcy itself stops creditors, just stops them cold. They can't do anything. But until that happens, they can do lots of things. So the timing of the filing is important, and a lot of it's dictated by what happens in the months prior to.
So it sounds like, the best time to get help, because there is so much strategy that can come into this, is as early as possible. Because like you said, if you're making payments to insiders, mom, dad, brother, sister, you pick it, that could have a really, really awful outcome if that's clawed back. So following that theme though of timing, so if a potential client calls you with a need for a Chapter 7, what's the standard timeline? When do they get to finally say, I'm done, this is behind me now, I can think about the future and not worry about the past? I mean, what's that normal timeline?
Well, I tell my clients that on the day that we file the bankruptcy, you are protected and you can consider these debts gone. But the formality of it is that it generally takes 4 to 5 months for that process to finalize and get an official discharge. There's time constraints involved. There's deadlines involved. The creditors have to have a certain amount of time to file objections where appropriate, and just a certain amount of time has to pass with certain events that have to take place for it to become official. But in most cases, when I notify my clients that the discharge has come in and your bankruptcy is officially over, they've moved on because they forgot all about it. And they're like, oh my God, thank you. I kind of forgot about this. It's great news, because they've already, from the next day after filing, all those debts are gone. Those creditors are gone. They can't contact you anymore. And for the most part, everything you do after that doesn't impact the bankruptcy. So it's just literally like turning the page, getting a fresh start, and it happens right away.
Oh, wow. So it's a quick I mean, generally a pretty quick process, because I imagine anybody who's in a situation where they need a Chapter 7, they've had months or years of things building up. And what you're saying is that generally with the right counsel and support, you can be cleaned up and, ready to move on to the next chapter of life pretty quick.
Yes, and as far as a very important issue, credit scores and things of that nature, what a lot of my clients are really surprised to find out is within 12 months of the filing of the bankruptcy, their credit score actually will increase, oftentimes substantially. Particularly if the credit score has already been damaged, because they were in default, which is the typical situation. Most clients got into a default situation before filing for bankruptcy. Their credit score takes a plunge. But after the bankruptcy, the debt's eliminated. So the person's debt to income ratio changes. And as long as they've reestablished credit, which isn't a problem after bankruptcy, believe it or not, then they can rebuild their credit and actually see a good credit score within a year.
Wow. So there's light at the end of the tunnel.
That's the good stuff. The bad stuff is that if you try to get a home loan within 2 to 4 years, it's a problem. It depends on the lender. Some would say 2 years, some would say, 4. But if you're going to buy a house by yourself or a husband and wife and they're both filed for bankruptcy, they're going to have to wait to do that. And then for car loans, there's not really a delay, but the interest rate tends to be pretty high if you do it within a year or two of bankruptcy. So there's some downsides too, obviously.
Yeah. So talking about downside or bad stuff, what's the one mistake you see all the time? Maybe someone tried to do it themselves, DIY'd this thing and came to you afterwards. Do you see like one mistake, or do you have one warning that you share with everybody of, hey, I can help you, but don't do this?
Well, I would say change title, because you're afraid to lose something. There's almost always a way you can keep it or some
Wait, you mean I
strategy.
can't just give all my assets to my brother like the
You
day
can't do
before
that
and
unless
keep
your
everything?
brother pays you fair value, and then what was the point of doing that anyway? Uh, because you're in this basically in the same position. You don't have the asset, but you have the cash value, so you're in the same position. So that's a mistake people make. The payment of to certain creditors of money prior to within certain deadlines is a problem. Incurring using your credit cards or giving cash advances or balance transfers within that 90-day period is also a problem, because if you're going to do a bankruptcy, you want it all to count. You don't want to have some of it being deemed non-dischargeable,
Mhm.
and sometimes it can be if you incur certain debts, a certain amount of debts for certain things within a certain period of time. It's usually that 90-day window or so. It could be deemed non-dischargeable, and you're still be on the hook for it. So those are some mistakes that people make unbeknownst to them. The other one I see a lot of is people that utilize the services of debt consolidation companies or debt settlement companies that aren't attorneys. Sometimes they work, but sometimes a lot of times they don't. And people will come to me after they've been in some form of a payment plan that they've been paying a third party to, and the third party promise that we'll settle all these debts. Well, they don't have magic ability to settle debts, so the creditors are or hold all the cards. And particularly if they're not a lawyer, they can't even threaten a bankruptcy on their behalf. So they don't have any real leverage. And so a lot of times they don't settle with all of the creditors, and it just takes one creditor to file a lawsuit to force somebody to go, oh my goodness, so now I have to do a bankruptcy. So all that money that they paid for this payment plan theoretically was money they could have kept for their own purposes and for their own life expenses and support, because they ended up having to do a bankruptcy after all. So I do see that a lot.
Wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
that's two powerful observations for things to be careful of.
Yeah.
So it's always this part of the podcast. I like to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot of business, a lot of great information about bankruptcy, how people can strategize properly to get the relief they needed. But I always like to pause for a second and just what I call the backside of the card, something personal. So I usually share with with the audience something I like to do. I'm an avid mountain biker. I get out in the mountains as much as possible. So Brent, what's one backside of the card fun thing about you?
That's cool, by the way, that you do that. I'm a family guy, and I love sports. So I love spending time with my wife, and I have a daughter that's in her 20s, but I love spending time with her. I love dogs. I have a wonderful Labradoodle dog that I love to spend time with. Um, my parents, thank God, are still with us, so I love to spend time with them. And I'm a baseball fanatic. I love the Dodgers. I love to go to a game when I can. I love pretty much all sports. I love to play sports. I love to watch sports. I like to ride my bike too. I probably couldn't keep up with you, but I'd like to get out there on my little hybrid bike. I go to the gym. I like to take the dog for a walk. And I like to go hiking.
Yeah.
So, you know, lots of good stuff, a lot of outdoorsy stuff when
So
I'm not working.
family guy, expert in bankruptcy, outdoorsman, and your prediction for the Dodgers, are they going to win it all this year?
Oh man, I say that every year. They're going to win it all, and I've only been right like once in the last like 30 years. So yeah, I'm going to say they're going to win it all again,
Yeah.
just because that's my standard prediction. So
Okay.
who's
Well,
going
you
to
were right
remember
two,
anyway?
3 years ago. So
Yeah, I was. So there you go. And I was right in 1988. So
there you go.
twice, once in each century.
What's the saying? A clock's right twice a day.
Yeah, exactly. Broken clock. Yeah, there you go.
So before we wrap it up, do you have one suggestion for our listeners who are consider bankruptcy that they should, if they're listening at all, pay attention to this? This is the one tip or one suggestion that you want everyone to hear.
If you're talking about for people that may be thinking about doing a bankruptcy,
Correct.
what we talked about before, Chris, the pre-planning and the strategizing, don't bury your head in the sand. And if you need assistance, don't be embarrassed, because it's tough out there. And bankruptcy is not for everybody. It's not available for everybody, but it's really important for the good of yourself, the good of your family. You have to look at your family like a business, and do what's in the best interest of the family. Seek guidance as to what is available. I do consultations. I don't charge to consult with a prospective client to give them their options. And sometimes it's not bankruptcy, sometimes it's debt settlement. And when debt settlement is not bankruptcy, obviously, uh, it's negotiation. And I use the bankruptcy code and my ability to file a bankruptcy as a way to obtain leverage against a creditor that might think they have all the leverage. Well, if they're truly concerned about a bankruptcy filing, and they, in most cases they should be, it affects their ability to get paid. They want to talk about alternative options, so suddenly you can take back what I call the leverage and start hammering them a little bit, try to get the creditor to accept something that makes sense for both sides to avoid bankruptcy. But that oftentimes that's only when there's a one or two creditors, or bankruptcy is just not an option in any way, shape, or form. The bankruptcy option just has so many benefits. There's no tax consequences for it, as opposed to debt settlement. You would know this better than I, but I mean, there's something called debt forgiveness debt that, or income that might come as a surprise to people at the beginning of the next year. They get, I guess, a 1099-C in many cases for the amount that was forgiven, is what they call it, the difference between what was paid and what was owed. And that can cause problems. So that's oftentimes a factor to consider when you're weighing what's in your best interest. But debt settlement is an option outside of bankruptcy, but it's one of the options. So knowing what your options are, knowing what's available as soon as possible, knowing if it could be available in the future and what to do and not to do prior to that time is absolutely critical.
Well, yeah, and don't ignore it. Even though it has to be emotionally a very difficult time, know that there's help out there, and there may be some very great options, but you can't explore it until you actually ask for help. So that's a great suggestion. So if any of the listeners want to reach out to you and say maybe they need help, maybe they're in a situation that would consider a Chapter 7, how can they reach you? How can they contact you?
Okay, well, my phone number, I'll just quickly mention it. It's 805-494-8400. So 805-494-8400. My assistant, Marie, is available to answer the phone. I'm pretty quick to get a hold of. If I'm not available, I call back people pretty quickly, or as quickly as I can. Also, our website, it's BrentGeorgeLaw.com. So www.BrentGeorgeLaw.com. And then I guess the last piece of information would be an email address, and it falls in line with my website address. It's Brent, BRENT, at BrentGeorgeLaw.com. And I'm always available by email, that's for sure.
Okay. Well,
and
Brent,
I have an office in Thousand Oaks and a satellite office in Oxnard to meet people that maybe live out more in that direction.
Okay. Well, Brent, it was so great to talk to you. It's been some great information that I think people will find very valuable this year. So thanks so much for your time and for being a guest on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris, for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, sir.